Hey everybody, this is Mark. Welcome back to Beyond Profit, a global perspective. And today we're going to talk about comparing countries along cultural dimensions. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. Let's go. As usual, if you're enjoying what you see and you think that this is helpful stuff, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends. I'm all about trying to help people out here. I'm going to do something a little bit different here with this video. A lot of times we talk about big concepts and issues and things, and this time it's going to be a little bit more technical than that. And so it's not your thing, that's fine, but I'm actually putting this video together to hopefully be helpful to certain groups of people, right? First of all, I have some students out there that want to try to understand how to compare different countries along cultural dimensions in a way that isn't totally subjective. And it's important because sometimes there's assignments, projects, and so on that will help them. But also, for those of you who are professional business practitioners, those of you who may be interested in penetrating a market with your existing business, starting new business enterprises overseas and things like that, or even just being an expatriate and trying to prepare for the possibility of living in another country, this stuff is pretty useful, right? When you put together a global business plan, it's something that can be very helpful in terms of an analysis, but it's also a good idea, like if you just want to go live overseas or if you're trying to manage people overseas, trying to understand those cultural differences. And so I'm going to introduce you to Geert Hofstede's work. This guy is somebody who's been for many years gathering data on this stuff and show you how to navigate his website and also ways in which you can analyze and interpret some of what that means. One of the ways that we can compare countries is by looking at them and their cultural differences. Now, this could be a subjective exercise, right? You go out and do a lot of research on the internet and find out differences between countries. But a guy named Geert Hofstede put together a way of comparing cultures that is based on data. It's quite a bit more systematic. And so I want to share this with you here because I think it's a really great tool. And then also sort of show you what these indicators mean and how to do some comparisons. So if we go to the website Hofstede Insights, which is Hofstede is spelled Hofstede, then slide down here. Let us compare some different countries. So let's say that, assuming that I've got an American audience here, we're going to start with the United States. So we're going to look at different levels of these indicators along the United States. And by the way, I'll explain what these are here in a few minutes, but let's just look at the numbers first. And then let's say we want to compare it with, we'll just pick a South American country like Brazil. And then let's pick out something that's completely different, like China. So you have three different countries, each indicated by the color, with different measures along these cultural indicators. So I'm going to return to this in just a second. But first, I want to share with you sort of what all of these indicators mean. So one way of measuring cultural differences is along the lines of power distance. So with power distance, you are asking the question, to what extent do the people in that country accept that there are power inequalities in society? If there's a high power distance, that means they're inclined to accept it. In other words, they're more likely to accept the fact that, well, there's going to be some people who are rich, there's some people who are poor, some people have all the power, some people don't have any power. That's just the way it is. Things are not going to change. There's not going to be a lot of social mobility and movement in my society. This is what I'm going to accept as normal, right? Low means that you reject that. You think, hey, there could be quite a bit of social mobility in my society, or, just because you're rich doesn't mean that you couldn't be poor tomorrow, or you could be poor and rags to riches story, and off we go. We're making $1 million in a few years, right? So that's basically what the high power distance or the low power distance indicator means. Some examples of high PDI countries are Arabic-speaking countries, Russia, India, and China. Low would be Japan, Australia, and Canada. Another indicator is individualism. This measures the extent to which a society believes that the individual is sort of the core of what's important in the society, or whether or not they believe that the collective, the group, is more important. And that plays out, I think a great way to compare this out would say if you look at the differences between the United States and China. In the United States, we're an extremely individualistic culture. And you can see this if you're looking at the individual indicator there, right? In the United States, we tend to believe that people make a difference, like individual people make a difference, right? It's a Wonderful Life, that great old James Stewart movie, suggests that, if his life changed, or if he wasn't here at all, then it would create a chain reaction that would change the way the world is. And so the individual person and the decisions they make are extremely important in terms of the development of the society and what those consequences are going to be. So as a result, we're going to value the individual. If you look at a country like China, it's not that individuals don't matter, but they may be less consequential than we tend to think, right? We may be more biased in our Western sort of orientation toward believing that individuals make a lot of difference. Maybe, grand scheme of things, I don't mean that much in terms of the whole big scope of things and the big story. And so there are countries that are more collectivist that would tend to look more at the world in that manner. That also plays out in terms of the way that we look at individual rights, right? If the individual is extremely important in society, then that means we have a system that's built around supporting that. Think about constitutional values, such as being innocent until proven guilty, right? That pretty much means that somebody could go and commit a murder, but unless you have the evidence, then there's not going to be a consequence to that, right? It's quite possible, and sometimes this happens, that a murderer may get away with murder because our system doesn't have the protections in order to keep society from this harmful person. But it's more important, though, that we protect the rights of those individuals. In China, on the other hand, the rights of the individual aren't nearly as important, right? What's more important is protecting society, making sure that we are safe. Therefore, it's not uncommon for them to go on campaigns where the government will say, hey, there's a whole lot of corruption going on. We suspect that there's corruption in this area, and in fact, we're very, very sure there's some of this going on. So we're just going to sweep up pretty much everybody who seems to be associated with that and punish them collectively, do something different with them. And yeah, you're going to get some innocent people who end up getting in trouble. But in terms of protecting the collective, that sort of value is much more important. So if you look at those cultures that are more highly individualistic, the United States, of course, is very high. Western Europe is fairly high as well. More highly collective societies would be ones like China, Korea, and Japan. Another way to look at cultural differences is to look at motivation toward achievement and success. Some people really are motivated toward rewards, toward outcomes, and so on, and some aren't, right? Another dimension is uncertainty avoidance. That is how risk-averse people are in the country. A high score means that you don't like risk. Low scores mean that you're more likely to engage in risk. So high-risk countries would be those like Greece, countries with a Catholic background, Buddhist, and Arabic. More high risk, inclined toward higher risk would be countries like Singapore, those countries that are traditionally Protestant, and those with Chinese influences. And I think that's an important point to bring up, is that there's going to be differences in certain indicators when you compare countries, and there's going to be certain similarities. So like if you look at the United States and China, they're about as different as they can be if you're looking at individualism versus collectivism, right? But if you're looking at uncertainty avoidance, they actually have quite a similar number. That is, they're both fairly inclined for individuals to believe that it's okay to take risks on certain things. Another dimension is high long-term orientation. The country or those people in the country appreciate long-term commitments and respect tradition, strong work ethic. Long-term rewards are expected as a result of today's hard work. Business may take longer to develop this in a society, particularly for an outsider, right? The other side of it is more of a short-term orientation. And again, I think we'll talk about China and the United States again, you can see that there's a huge difference between them, right? With China being extremely long-term oriented and the United States not so much, right? If you look at China, for example, they're one of the oldest civilizations, if not the oldest civilization in the world, with a history of 4,000 years. They don't think about time in terms of years and months in the same way as we do, right? They're thinking more along generations. What's the real long-term big picture here? In the United States, we forget what news story was the big thing last week, and our businesses are obsessed with quarterly returns. And in business, that's actually kind of an interesting contrast, right? Chinese business people and policymakers are not necessarily thinking about how much money a business might make in the next quarter, but maybe a little more patient with that business, thinking about the long run, like, okay, we might be losing for a while, but in the long run, there might be a good investment to be made here. And the Chinese are much more comfortable with that line of thinking, say, than Americans are. Another cultural dimension is indulgence. That stands for a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. Restraint stands for a society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. So there are some countries that, I want it now, I don't want to have to wait for it. And there are some that are like, okay, well, I can deny myself for long periods of time. So let's go back to the website, our comparison between Brazil, China, and the United States. If you look at power distance, for example, right, you can see that China has a very high power distance, which suggests that there's not a lot of perception of the possibility of social mobility. In the United States, it's quite a bit lower, although not super low, right? I mean, it could be lower, but we tend to believe in this mythology of the rags to riches story, whether it's true or not, right? And on the individual score, again, you can see the United States being highly individualistic as opposed to China being more collectivist. Surprisingly enough, Brazil appears to be less individualistic than China or the United States. If you look at uncertainty avoidance, you can see that Brazil is much higher on the uncertainty avoidance indicator. The United States is sort of in the middle, and China is much lower on that end. And so people of Brazil being much more inclined toward being comfortable with uncertainty, whereas people in China much less concerned with that. Then there's long-term orientation. And as I mentioned earlier, not surprisingly, China is much higher on long-term orientation than the United States. Brazil, much less so. And finally, we get the indicator of indulgence, where the United States is, again, not surprisingly, very high on the indulgence side. Brazil, pretty high too. Chinese being much more willing to sacrifice certain things. So as you can see, there are ways to make meaningful distinctions between countries along cultural dimensions. And hopefully you can use this data in order to help you develop a business plan, to help you move into another country, to help you basically try to understand the differences between the way certain countries operate and how those people who live there, how their beliefs affect their behavior. So, hope you all got something out of it. Until next time, this is Mark. I will see you